Okay, we're back. So, I said before that, to make something, a waste is considered hazardous if it exhibits certain sorts of characteristics. The characteristics are ignitability, as you can see, corrosivity, something seeping through, reactivity, something might blow up, or something is toxic. Um, so, ignitability, does something catch fire? Is something capable during handling of starting a fire or exacerbating a fire once started? So, you know, think of gasoline, right? Or if it's stored wrong, if it gets hot, if there's friction, or if there is existing fire or lighter fluid, something like that, exacerbating one. Okay, and this is assigned, that this risk, this hazardous characteristic is called DO01. You can go to pause and look at the video under ignitability, start at 220 to see an example of that. So you can pause me and go do that. Okay, the next one we're going to talk about is corrosivity. So if something can corrode a container, or some waste can escape. So think of something dissolving, corroding, rust, um, an acid that corrodes something. And then what can happen if it is something corrodes their container, the waste can go out into the world and there can be a release, and other things can be released. So think of wastes, either acids or bases, so high in acidity or low, very basic. And then the EPA number for that is DO02. And then you can pause this and look at that video. And for you Breaking Bad fans, I hope you appreciate it. And if you are faint of heart, you might want to half close your eyes. Okay, pause this and go look at that. All right, we're back, hopefully. And then reactivity, something that can react violently during or explode during handling or management. Again, friction, heat. So think of the volcano science fair experiment, right? Boom, and then you could look at that. The video attached under reactivity for that one. Okay, and then toxicity. Okay, so the toxicity, oh my, whoops. Any something that is likely to leach a hazardous concentration of toxic chemicals. So toxic is like really bad. Something that can kill you, at least either in the short term or in the long term. Oh, so it's likely to leach hazardous concentration of certain toxic constituents into the groundwater if mismanaged. And then I have two Batman videos, one of the Joker and one of Harley Quinn, one classic, one more recent. So you can look at those on toxicity. Okay, so there is a rule called the mixture rule. So if you have a hazardous waste, right, one that exhibits one of those four characteristics, and then you mix that with a solid waste. So then the solid waste ceases being just your standard solid waste and it becomes a hazardous waste. If it is when it's mixed with solid waste, if that hazardous characteristic disappears for some reason, then it can be exempted from this mixture rule and no longer considered a hazardous waste. If it contains wastewater, it's exempted because then it goes under the Clean Water Act. And if it's just a teeny itty bitty bit of this bad hazardous waste, it can be exempted too. And sometimes, you're adding this other product or entity into the hazardous waste on purpose to make it less hazardous, and then that is a treatment, and you can't get the exemption for that one. Waste derived from the treatment, storage, or disposal of a hazardous waste is also a hazardous waste. So if I'm like recycling hazardous waste and then there's waste derived from that, or something along those lines, it is also considered a hazardous waste unless it no longer exhibits that hazardous characteristic. Then it's exempted from the derived from rule. Okay, so it's a little flowchart, big fan of flowchart, to find out if something is a hazardous waste. If it's a solid waste, yes. If it's excluded from the definition of solid or hazardous waste, no. Is it have a characteristic and it wasn't delisted, then it is subject to RCRA. If any of those things don't apply, you might be kicked out, and it's not subject to RCRA's subtitle C regulation. The contained in rule, that's if the material contaminated with the hazardous waste is also a hazardous waste. So think of like soil that has gasoline in it. If something is contained with inside a waste, it's a hazardous waste. So one of the things, that RCRA and the 1984 amendments dealt with is, trying waste minimization. And part of the waste minimization is recycling and reclaiming this. So things that are included in RCRA under the recycling and reclamation waste minimization category is burning to recover energy. So if you burn waste to recover energy, that's considered like recycling and reclamation. Speculative accumulation, like people are garbage pickers, that kind of thing. Things that are solid waste after they are recycled are, these characteristic sludges, characteristic listed and characteristic byproducts, spent materials, chemical products, scrap metal, right? And, so EPA, RCRA deals with waste management, not waste production. So, anywho, the RCRA laws apply there. So then if you're like in this recycling facility, you're going to be also subject to RCRA if you create a hazardous waste from your recycling materials. Okay, so they talk about what waste management is, right? So you're creating this waste, and anyone managing hazardous waste, we call these waste managers. So you could be an owner or operator of what we call a treatment, storage, and disposal facility. So that's a TSD, and we'll talk about TSDs for the rest of the class. And it can be the owner or operator. So the owner owns the facility, and the operator is responsible for making sure that all the rules are followed. Manager as well. Okay, and that can be, as we talked about it before, a generator, transporter, or a TSD. Okay, a facility that generates, transports, or owns or operates a storage or disposal facility. Okay, so these managers are the ones who have the responsibility under RCRA to report the name, the location, and the EPA waste number. Where it is going or where it is located has to be identified. And if you don't notify the EPA of this, then you're subject to penalties. So any of these managers has to notify the EPA once they know that they have hazardous waste within 90 days of it being identified as hazards. So that's just like who does it in the facility, and we'll talk about the different facilities now. Okay, so the first category of facility, right, this is the cradle part, are the generators. Okay, those are the producers of the waste. So they're like, okay, we are, doing some manufacturing process and we create waste. So we are a generator. We want to create this waste. We have to go and apply with the EPA for some sort of identification number as a generator. So I have to, if I am a generator, I have to get an ID number from the EPA, register with the EPA as a hazardous waste generator. Then I have to prepare for every batch of hazardous waste that I produce. I have to prepare a manifest. So think of like, oh, it's a list, right? Just kind of like a packing list. And that manifest stays with that batch of hazardous waste from cradle, right? My generating process until grave. And then I'm the generator. I start this whole process. And one of the things after I I create these manifests, and then I put it in some sort of containment unit, right? Whether it's a barrel or I don't know, a plastic bag or a drum, whatever, however it is going to be transported, I put it in there, and that those have to be properly labeled, properly packaged for the type of waste that it is, and it must contain the manifest. So the manifest has things like, is this on my next slide? Yeah, this is what it's called, the Uniform Hazardous Waste Manifest. And it has a description of the waste, right? With the EPA, whatever the EPA waste number it is, the EPA ID of the generator, transporter, or TSD facility, depending on where you are in the process of disposing this. You, as this manager, have to personally sign and say that you have appropriately packaged and labeled this hazardous waste according to RCRA. You have to certify that you have a program in place that complies with RCRA. And then these copies are made for each handler, so you keep your copy of the manifest as from when the waste left you, but then copies stay with the original will stay with the waste, and then each next handler fills out their own section before it goes back, and then at the end, the last man standing sends a copy back to the original generator to say like, okay, this is where the waste finally ended up, so that the generator has the obligation of creating the manifest and storing the final location of it, having the manifest, the ending manifest. So I think this is here it comes up. This is a PDF of what that manifest looks like, right? So you have your generator ID number, your address. Here's your transporter's name. These are, the types of waste. It has the waste codes. So that's kind of what your manifest looks like. When you are a generator, you have to label the waste with the proper, what are they called? Placards, I think, or whatever labels, placarding. There it is. If it's hazardous, toxic, poison, flammable, all of those, there's the toxic and poison thing. This is one that would be like ignitability, stuff that could happen. So if the generator, after it gets this waste off its site, does not get that final manifest back, they have to, create an exception report and submit that to the EPA, and they have to figure out where it is and who messed up this manifest. And again, they're responsible for properly preparing the waste, putting it in the proper receptacle, and putting the proper labeling on the receptacles. Okay. Oh, this is a funny one. I'll put it on for you. Hopefully you can see it. If it's poor quality for you, then I don't think you get the audio. Oh, you know what? You don't get the audio, so I'm just going to post this video because I'm on a separate microphone. But it's Mr. Burns from The Simpsons uh, illegally dumping. So anywho, illegal dumping still happens, and but less than usual. So the illegal dumpers aren't the ones who have the EPA ID numbers, but people are more likely to report things if it looks funny. And sorry, I'm going to write a note to post that. Anyway, it's harder to get it, but it still happens. Nobody's saying it's perfect system. Okay, waste minimization. That's that kind of recycling piece of it. Generators have to try to reduce the volume and risk associated with these hazardous materials, whether it's reusing things, recycling and reusing materials before they're actually transported off site. They have to file biennial reports with reporting their waste minimization efforts. Oh, and even if they export their waste to a foreign country, they still have to go through RCRA with the manifest. And I guess I didn't even realize this until I started teaching this class, but places in the US may import hazardous wastes. um, and we call them that, even though they haven't created it, they are generators because they're the first ones bringing this hazardous waste into the country. There's also a category called small quantity generators, or SQGs, which are smaller producers of waste. And since they're, not producing as much, it might not be economically feasible for them to get the waste off their site within a short period of time. So they are allowed to store these small quantities of hazardous waste on their own premises, without getting a special permit as a TSD, but they still have to follow the manifest system. And then, when maybe they get a big enough shipment to get it off their site, then the manifest will go with the waste. Okay, so that is our generators. Our next category are our transporters. And our transporters are the ones who get it off the site. So, it might be a trucking company, might be a barge, rail, road, water, air. I think it's probably unlikely you're going to have a lot of hazardous waste that's transported by air, but I guess it could happen. And they have to follow those rules of labeling and signs. So it's already on their on the receptacle, but maybe on their truck or on their train, they have to also have that there. They have to have their own EPA ID number. They have to fill out all the manifests. RCRA, even if I'm just transporting it, say from Glen Ellen to Palatine, even if it's within the state, intrastate, RCRA is still applies. The only way I can move my stuff without following RCRA is, from building A to building B within my own facility. So anything within my own facility. RCRA rules, they complement Department of Transportation standards about, hazardous material transport, things like that. If there's any spill, or they call it release for hazardous waste, they have to be reported to the EPA. A transporter, say you're like a trucking company and you bring all the stuff to one facility, and then you do a bigger shipment somewhere else, you can store it for 10 days without a special permit, and you have to hang on to those manifests for at least 3 years. If the transporter alters the waste, like does any treatment at all, then they become generators, and then they have the responsibility of generators as well as transporters. Okay, the next category are these TSDs, treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. So these are any facilities that receive hazardous waste to either treat, store, or dispose. Okay, and they're under section 3004 of RCRA. So a treatment facility, the anyone who uses something to change the hazardous waste, to make it better, right? Neutralize it, either or to reuse it as energy, somehow make it less hazardous, safer to transport, or make it smaller in any way. So they're changing the waste in one way or another is a treatment facility. Okay, then you have their storage and disposal facilities. Storage, they're holding the hazardous waste for a little bit of time. And that might be also where the waste is treated. And then they are the disposal facility. So that's like the intentional final resting place of the waste, the grave, you may call it. Okay, so these TSDs have to be permitted. They have to, obviously give your basic information, contact information, and your facility information, but you also must demonstrate RCRA compliance. There is a process with application and review, and there's opportunity for public comment to be, maybe somebody doesn't really want a hazardous waste treatment facility in their town. But once you get your permit, it's good for 10 years. God forbid something happens, a release, you have to take whatever corrective action necessary to clean it up, regardless of when it happened. So if it's in your possession, even after the facility is closed, and we'll get to that in a minute, you have to complete the appropriate corrective action in the event of a release. Any TSD is subject to EPA inspection even after they're closed. Now, technically, you're supposed to, the EPA needs a warrant to do that, but in practice, if the EPA says they want to inspect your facility, you say, sure, because I got nothing to hide. Because if you did have something to hide and the EPA just mentioned it and you have to get a warrant, it would look bad for your facility. So usually it's just like, hey, we want to inspect your facility, and then you set up a date. These facilities have certain standards for training their personnel, security. So the people who are there have to know what's stored there and how to make sure that these things are safely contained. Look out for possible breaches or releases. You have to have security, again, from innocent people just randomly going in there, and for people up to no good going in there to either steal hazardous waste or, somehow cause damage, some sort of terrorism kind of thing. The owners of the facilities have to exhibit financial responsibility. They can't just be like flash in the pan, because there's a lot of money involved in maintaining these facilities. Their whatever containers or receptacles have to meet certain standards, right? Whatever storage tanks, if it's a landfill, whatever liner has to be there, if it's an incinerator, whatever filter has to be there. There are certain standards that have to be met. Any TSD, they have to have an EPA ID. And once they get the waste, they have to sample it, even though it's manifested. They have to sample it to make sure that it is what it says it is, and to determine how to properly manage that waste. So there are design, construction, and operation standards for TSDs, like security system, training of personnel. They need emergency response systems in place, like alarms and sprinklers, if that's appropriate. Equipment capable of decontaminating people. This is a Silkwood shower that I posted that on video. If you don't know what a Silkwood shower it is, safety of your employees. Okay, the record keeping is basically your manifests. They have to be sent back to the generator within 30 days of receiving them, and everybody keeps their manifest for 3 years. And you make biennial reports to the EPA of your activities. If you have any unmanifested waste, you have to report them, and any accident or releases have to be reported to the EPA. So this, remember in the beginning when I was talking about things, never go away. At some point, a TSD is full. It's no longer accepting waste. They call that closure phase. Even during their closure phase, they're like, all right, we're done. No more waste. Even after that phase, RCRA and TSD, all of those requirements still apply. The post-closure period for a TSD is 30 years. So when you're applying to be a TSD, you have to prove that you're financially able to support both the closure and the post-closure phases, so that you're responsible for this resting place of this hazardous waste for 30 days after you're getting money for it. So, I mean, you have to have kind of a lot of money, demonstrate a lot of money, because, even after it's closed, bad things can happen. You still have to be monitoring the facility. You still have to have security. You still have to even have people going in, inspecting to make sure that there haven't been releases or failures in your systems at all. There are state-regulated hazardous waste programs, and RCRA does allow states to regulate hazardous waste as long as they're at least as strict as RCRA. Sometimes there is joint permitting, so you need a RCRA permit as well as a state permit. In Blue Circle Cement versus Board of County Commissioners is in the book. Question was, did these RCRA hazardous waste restrictions preempt local ordinances? And the court said no. They just can't be less restrictive. You can have more restrictive state or local requirements than federal. The enforcement of RCRA, you have all of your traditional methods available, administrative hearings and fines. You have that private attorney general where a citizen can come in and say, claim a violation of RCRA. If there are blatant violations, the feds can come in and criminally prosecute generators, transporters, or TSDs for violations of RCRA. But there is, just like all these other environmental laws, there's no civil rights actions allowed under RCRA. The case of Leland versus Moran saw to that. Okay, civil penalties up to $25,000 a day, criminal up to $50,000 and 2 years in prison, and for knowing violations, $250,000 and 15 years in prison. That's for individuals, and $1 million for organizations. RCRA requires that the EPA engage in research and development on technology for waste handling, treatment, and disposal, waste minimization, protecting human health and safety. But EPA hasn't done such a great job on the R&D on for hazardous waste. Okay, so Yucca Mountain, that's kind of the end of the RCRA part. But Yucca Mountain is a place in Nevada, way out in the middle of the desert, which was started to be built, I think it was in 2006, 2008. and it was going to be our national repository for nuclear waste. Um, and it's just like a big tunnel in the desert. And all of our like spent nuclear rods were meant to go in there. And, it's a good spot because it's the desert. There's going to be no flooding, and then leaching into the soil. So in 2011, I think that was Obama, said, nope, the Shoshone Nation opposed, the governor of the representatives from Nevada all oppose it because they don't want this stuff in their state. Um, and Obama ceased the funding in 2011. So then there was kind of nothing. When Trump was president, he wanted Yucca Mountain construction to be continued. The funding request was denied by Congress. Biden says he's not going to open Yucca Mountain. There's another option, which is on all of this stuff is in the module. There's another option in New Mexico, but currently these nuclear rods are being stored on site. So it's like a big problem, this nuclear waste. So you should watch for the discussion board. I want you to watch this. There's also a John Oliver clip as well. This was the one in New Mexico, which is also posted in the module, of the crazy stuff and what the heck we're going to do with this radioactive waste in the long term. This is just a little PSA. So for the rest of the module here, I'm going to post that little. So those are all of our characteristic little lectures there. And here's the supplementary materials for the discussion board, the New Mexico one, the Yucca Mountain, John Oliver. So for your this week, you're going to be doing a quiz and responding to in the discussion board about this nuclear repository problem. So that is it. Sorry for my voice. I apologize. And you guys have a good week. And please reach out to me with any questions.